Hello, everybody. Today is January 5th, 2023, and this is our inaugural 2023 OLM issue triage and working group meeting. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to take a quick look at the agenda. There we go. All right, it looks like Varsha has some open questions regarding the operator controller API and its integration with DEPI. So issues 74 and 77. Before we jump into these, Varsha, is there anything you want to bring up?
Yeah, this is the first time me attending the meeting. So do we do the triage and then go over the discussion? I can wait for it, or I can go over what I've understood from the issues.
We typically start with the agenda and then we'll move in. What we've been doing lately has been focusing on generating work in the form of GitHub issues, such that contributors can get involved.
Okay, cool. I can get started. So hi everyone, I am Varsha from the operator framework team. I've just started working on the OLM V1 milestones, specifically on the operator controller side. So I have these two issues. Alex, would you mind opening them?
Yep.
Thanks. So the first one is regarding how the operator controller can provide DEPI with a set of constraints and then return a solution set. And the second one is the trailing part of the issue is after DEPI returns a solution set, how does operator controller handle it? So I just tried to break down the issue based on my understanding of the DEPI code base. And I have a few follow-up questions, and I'd really appreciate if someone could help me understand how the different components are connected, or if I'm missing something, and probably help with some pointers on how to get started with this. So my understanding is that for the DEPI solver, we need two inputs, which is the entity source and the constraint generator. And entity source, if I'm not wrong, are the list of packages which need to be installed, which includes the dependencies, and the constraint generator is kind of a variable source, which is basically, I think, Per and Dan had a PR on the various kinds of OLM constraints. So the question which I have is, how does the operator controller get the inputs, gets the inputs for this? Because right now it looks like all operator controller API has is just the package name. And if we are looking to expand the spec of the operator controller, what are we looking at? If that's the entry point, are we going to provide an FPC bundle to it? Or are we looking for something else in the cluster to query based on what Truckpack provisioner installs and then provide it to the DEPI? So these are the two questions which I have written there. One is regarding the inputs to the operator controller, and the second is for the constraint values. If we are getting it from the FPC fields, then does the operator controller API have access to the bundle? Does it query the cluster to get the bundle deployment, or does it have the access to the FPC bundle which the user provides?
So I wish Per were here, because I think he'd probably be able to explain this best. But my impression of this piece of work is essentially that whenever we reconcile, when we call the operator controller reconciler, we're going to list all of the operator objects and then build constraints out of them, which essentially say for each one of them, it's mandatory and it has to, and whatever gets chosen has to have this package name. Like that's what we're trying to do at first. So I think that's like the constraint generator piece of it, where we're basically saying like, here's some extra, here's the like the mandatory things that have to be in the solution based on the operator objects that exist. And then separately, the entity sources is essentially like the way that we know about the catalogs. So my understanding is that somewhere out there, somewhere we've got an entity source that implements the gRPC API client and can call list bundles, which is theoretically somewhat under the hood and already implemented and not something that the operator controller necessarily knows about directly, other than like we've got to configure it maybe. But maybe even not, like maybe we just say like, hey, we want the catalog source, entity source, and then it knows like, okay, well, I'm going to go and look for catalog sources and populate a cache based on that. But I think Para probably knows more about that unless someone else can provide more details there. And then once you've got those two things hooked up, then you would, call solve. The thing that I'm still not clear on, which is maybe yet another question to add to this list, is how do we know when to reconcile? Like clearly we know we can reconcile by watching operator objects, but what about watching the catalog source, or like something that this entity source can trigger a reconciliation using like a source.channel or something? So that's another open question in my mind, but maybe that's neither here nor there. We can maybe gloss over that piece of it for now. Hopefully I somewhat answered the question, but we might need to talk to Pear for more.
Yep, that makes sense. Just one question. I'm not aware of the catalog source side of things. So how does the operator controller get access to it? Do we have work already done on that side, or how do we proceed with it? Or is it still under discussion or something?
So I think just to kind of, give you some historical context, because you haven't been involved in some of these meetings. There's, if we look at the OLM V1M milestone 1, there's a high level description of what we're trying to do here, right? And if you haven't seen this, I recommend taking a quick look at it. It's visible right here. If you go up to the no status part of this board, and it kind of describes what it is we're building for the first milestone, right? And it kind of just like outlines that we're basically just trying to install a single operator, 2 operators in this case, the Cockroach DB and Prometheus, and we can create them and delete them through the operator controller. And then these, you can think of this as the top level goal for milestone 1. And as you go down to 62, 63, 64, 65, and 602, all of these kind of outline, they're effectively epics. If you're familiar with sprint methodology, they line up and they just do a very specific thing. And if you click those, it kind of outlines what we need to do. And I'm pretty sure actually this one got closed recently, so we can update this. And simply because of how early we are in this process, like building OLM V1 milestone 1, there isn't, a lot of these are really pretty serial in terms of their completion. You could do some of the work out of band, but you probably have to mock stuff in order to make it work. And so the easiest way right now to figure out when you're getting involved and understanding like when I start this ticket, where should the project be, is by reading from the top of this no status column all the way through. And this is unique to milestone 1 simply because there's no single, we're building the core of the product, and before the core is built, there's not much opportunity for people that are jumping in to just expand in one specific area, because the thing they want to expand on might not exist. Now, going back to the questions that you brought up here, once you had raised these questions like, where are we getting these inputs and everything? In terms of talking to the catalog source, if you read the earlier documents I listed or tickets, what you'll see is that we've strategically decided to use existing registry V1 catalog sources so that we aren't prevented from closing milestone 1 until we introduce the new catalog source API. And what this means is that we're using the registry V1 client that is currently used in OLM V0 in order to connect to those catalog pods. What this implies is that the the operator controller has watches on catalog sources so that it can identify those sources and connect to them in order to retrieve content and then use those as DEPI sources as it becomes available, which further implies that like the operator controller has the RBAC needed to watch and get specific catalog sources so it can connect to them and actually find the endpoint so that it can then make the gRPC cert roll request with the registry v1 client. So that would handle how we actually find these entity sources. And then I think, this is, some of the questions you pose really kind of highlight a shortcoming in the existing work that we've done. I think, OLM v1 milestone 1, this board does a good job explaining what we need to do in order to hit this demo that we've proposed, right? In the OLM v1 milestone 1 ticket. But it doesn't necessarily make it entirely easy for upstream contributors to jump in, find out where to go, and like what is the onboarding process. I don't think we've outlined anywhere how at this point, like how to really get involved and like digest all the information that's here. And so if you want something that could be really helpful for our team and our upstream community, would be to call out like, hey, I'm trying to learn how to do this. Where is the upstream facing documentation that tells me how to do that?
Okay. Yep, that makes sense. And just one other upstream related question. If I have to start working on any of those tickets, it would be helpful as an upstream contributor if we could have someone like a mentor assigned to probably, so for example, in case of DEPI, it would be nice if someone who knows about DEPI is mentioned in the ticket to at least ping them and follow up on to understand the concepts and get started. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Whether or not I think the best place to probably have most of those conversations, like, hey, I want to take on this ticket, can anyone help me? There's multiple avenues, and we have to decide as a community what avenue makes sense, right? We could just take the ticket, assign it to ourselves, and then ping the person who created it, like, hey, can you find me somebody to work on this with? Alternatively, we could have it like asynchronously done in Slack, where somebody just posts the ticket they're working on and asks for help. That kind of gets rid of the middleman, which is nice. So maybe that's a process we could work on defining now, and then we could make sure that we document it in one of our contributor pages such that people understand how to get involved.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Alex. I think like to get Varsha going immediately, it seems like the right person to pair with is Pear. And it also seems like we should probably try to spread some of Pear's DEPI knowledge around, because I feel like other areas have multiple people kind of thinking about and looking at them, but it seems like DEPI is primarily been the focus of only Pear. So maybe we can kill two birds with one stone there.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think Pear's the most suited to help onboard Varsha, and as Pear does that, it'd be really great if they do it under the guise of treating Varsha as an upstream contributor.
Yep.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I'll follow up with Pear on this particular ticket. And the second one, I guess, is kind of a follow-up. Let me get the number. I think it was 77, if I'm not wrong. Yep, that was 77. So for this, I think, again, I'll probably sync up with Pear on this, but just to bring that up, this is the second part where after the DEPI returns the solution, I guess these are the four things. How does a controller, the operator controller reconcile? And how do we identify if a particular bundle deployment is present on the cluster. If not, probably create this. But I think I'll sync up with Pair on how do we get the entity ID. And I think that is again tied on how we create an entity ID from the catalog source, which is the previous ticket. So yep, I think that answers my question, which I have. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. And Varcha, just to kind of give you some insight into this, that I think that little piece of information was intentionally left, vague, so that we didn't stifle development, right? In terms of what this identifier is going to look like when we integrate it with the, registry v1 client. That's something that's where, we didn't create a separate spike in order to investigate. It was going to be done as a part of this, the integration with DEPI.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't think that should really enter into anything we have to think about in the operator controller piece of this. Like, really, I would imagine that we just trust that DEPI has unique IDs, and to the operator controller, it doesn't matter what they are. We're just going to receive some and then potentially look some up or something, right? So they're just kind of opaque strings to us, at least from the operator controller perspective.
Okay.
But to answer that question there, I don't think we've decided what that unique identifier is, but I don't think that means we can't make progress.
Yep.
And I don't know if you saw in the chat, but Pair has an OLM CLI project that essentially does what we need to do in the operator controller, but comparatively once via CLI. So I linked a few things in there that should give a really, you could almost copy and paste things around and probably get something working on the operator controller. So that's a good resource to use probably.
Sure, I'll take a look at it. Thanks, Joe.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I think that brings this one to a close. Moving on, we'll look. I was going to propose that we start looking over some of the proposed milestone 2 entries, and then we could begin reaching consensus in terms of what milestone 2 is going to look like. As a general reminder, before we dive into that, if that's what we decide to do, I also want to remind everybody that if you're working on tickets in this board, please make sure to mark them as assigned to you and move them into the in progress column. Is everyone okay with us looking at milestone 2?
Yeah, Alex, just in case you didn't see my chat, I've got a drop for daycare pickup. It might be back before the meeting ends, but no promises. So just FYI.
All good. Cool. Oh, we should actually tag this one so it's easier, so we can create that. Add this label right now. Two. Awesome. And so if anybody's looking at the project board, I'll quickly just create this milestone 2 board. And we'll add a filter. This ticket is an existing one. The enhancements. Boom. Okie dokie, so. Should be a little easier to find now for everybody, but as we jump into this, what we've got. So OLM V1 milestone 2, we're trying to define some of the work that we'll be doing for that milestone. And Joe had a couple of suggestions. I don't know if everyone's had an opportunity to look at this. So do we want to take like a minute just to read this silently and then we can start talking about them? I'll take that as a yes. So we'll take 1 minute just to read through this. I'm going to include this in the chat in case people want to have full control over the screen. Okay, hopefully that was enough time for everybody to read through that and get an idea of what we want, what Joe proposed. Is as you were reading through that list, is there anything that jumps out as something that you guys might want to prioritize doing?
I think the upgrade stuff is a pretty obvious like next logical step, given we're kind of taking care of basic installation and uninstallation, right? And I feel like that's just the next most obvious feature to have.
I agree, and I think it's something that we were looking at some of the developers working on milestone 1. We're talking about like when we're doing, simple installation, like should we bother having an E2ET test that just starts looking at the upgrade experience and what that might be like? And I think some of the logic we're proposing in terms of how the operator controller installs generations of operators, you almost get the upgrade experience for free while doing that. There's obviously some extra work that needs to be done in that space to actually make it a good user experience. But I think we're going to very quickly be in a position where we can start working on that upgrade experience. And we might get some of it for free simply by implementing, in milestone 1, we proposed that we go to milestone 1 and we could clean this chat. I think it was actually one of the items that Varsha brought up, 70. Yeah, the correct bundle deployments exist for each thing. You basically get upgrades for free as long as the operator CR pointed to V1 of the operator installed, and then if resolution happens again and it now points to V2, that's technically an upgrade. You're moving from a cluster with V1 installed to a cluster with V2, and there's obviously like some user experience that we'd need to improve, but in terms of not accidentally breaking an upgrade and performing rollbacks as we want, but you do get pretty close to a definition of an upgrade just by implementing this ticket. So yeah, I would agree with you, Daniel.
It also has the benefit of I think being a functional area that has a big capability of exposing like weird edge cases and problems potentially with the architecture, and it's just good to do those early or find those early.
Yep. Does anybody else have anything from this list that they're excited for, or is there anything that people want to propose adding on to this as a potential milestone 2 item?
Yeah, I mean, I see that last point, the last bullet point, the sub point, Joe talks about a DEPI source other than OLM v0 catalog sources. So that kind of made me think, I wish Joe was here, but I'm not sure what exactly he's trying to say about the timeline for V1 catalog sources. I'd assume that at least during milestone 1, or let me ask this question. Did we decide how many milestones we are going to have before GA, or is it just we're playing it by the year and milestone 2 is as far as we're going for now, but then we'll have milestone 3 and 4?
Yeah, good question. So the answer to how many milestones is it going to take to get to the OLM V1 MVP? It's going to be as many as it takes. We are creating milestones as we gain enough information to define what work we're going to be doing next. As we get closer to doing those, and when we first create one of these milestones, they could be expressed at extremely high level, right? Like let's say we were at the very beginning of milestone 1 and we know milestone 2 we want to do upgrades. We might say like, oh, we created a like a meta ticket that just says operator controller does upgrades, but we're not going to start flushing that out with all the details in terms of what it needs to be done for that work until we get closer to it, because some of the work in milestone 1, like this install upgrade thing that we had just pointed to earlier, that might actually give us some insight into what that feature needs to look like, right? And it's hard to know that until you start actually seeing it. And so as we get closer to milestone 2 and we have stronger opinions in terms of what needs to happen for that milestone to be met, that's where it'd be more and more fleshed out. Now, so that I hope that answers like how many milestones are there going to be. It's going to be a byproduct of like when do we have everything completed that was defined in the MVP. I think you had a second question, which was like what Joe was talking about in this space. Is that correct?
But I think, yeah, but not really. I mean, I was going to say that if that's given your answer about how many milestones it's going to take, I think I was thinking that in milestone 2, for at least V1 catalog sources, we'll start, we would have had hopefully a direction decided on what direction we want to take, or the design finalized by milestone 2. So we'll start working on implementing V1 catalog sources for milestone 2. I was curious about what the statement means in terms of like, does that mean we'll be integrating any of the V1 catalog sources to any of these work that we are talking about right now? But it sounds like as we get closer to milestone 2 and things get more clear, we'll answer that question then.
Yeah, and I, just to kind of add some context into this, so a DEPI source doesn't necessarily mean like just what we treat catalog sources as today. You could imagine, so this is like, how would I put this? Some operators can only run on certain versions of Kubernetes because they rely on an API that gets deprecated at say 126. So from OLM v1's perspective, we could treat we could create a cluster version constraint that is fueled by a DEPI source. So we define a DEPI source to an endpoint, and that endpoint would say, hey, I'm going to introduce a global constraint that all operators that you install can run on OLM 126, or sorry, Kubernetes 126, right? And so there are multiple sources, DEPI sources that could be implemented that feed constraints into the resolver that are not limited to just, oh, these are DEPI sources, yeah. Like than just the catalog sources. Or I guess in this case, it's not talking about like, yeah, here we go. Yeah, the DEPI source would be, in this case, like it's a DEPI source that provides the cluster version into the resolver. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I remember this now about the cluster constraint, but it was still helpful to have anybody else who hasn't seen cluster constraint before that explanation. So thank you for that. Yep, makes sense. Okay, so I see that this is about cluster constraints and how cluster constraints are resolved. But having said that, I think I still want to make that point that I think probably by milestone 2, we'll have a design decided for V1 catalog sources. So in milestone 2, we'll start implementing whatever the design is for V1 catalog sources. So I don't know if you want to take that down right now, or maybe wait until we have a design decided.
I'm totally open to saying. Kevin,
Yeah, so what I would suggest is that maybe what we say is that for milestone 2, we plan on doing some integration POCs just to see what what that design looks like in terms of how it would potentially integrate with Debbie with Debbie. And then once we kind of have a good idea and work out any kinks there in milestone 3 or 4, we can start actually doing like more serious build outs and integrations.
yeah, I kind of agree with you that instead of if for milestone 2, instead of focusing on building a Deppy source implementation, maybe finalizing it the Deppy source API, such that we can remove the registry v1 client from Deppy and utilize like Deppy sources in order to find, the Deppy sources. And once that API is defined, that enables, we could do this cluster thing, or we could do the, I'll call it catalog source v1, the thing that Anik had been mentioning. It enables us to do a lot of this work, and it basically sets up the project so that we can integrate with, the work Anik is doing.
Okay,
If we
so sorry, finish your thought, Alex.
Nope, that's all I got.
I was going to say that I think that means that we'll capture a point that says integration POCs with V1 catalog sources or Deppy and operator API if it's needed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let's work on that wording, but yeah, that basically encompasses that. Catherine, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so I'll just capture upstream working group. We just Anik, does this need to define the Deppy source API, removing Deppy's reliance on the registry v1 client? I'm going to call this hard coded. It's hard coded 2 words or 1 word. Always spelled it 1 word. And I'm going to link to the related ticket, which is how's that look, Anik?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay, and we'll add another one. I'm just gonna Daniel, you worded this really well earlier, where you were discussing how like working on, ironing out how OLM V1 is going to upgrade operators will lead to prosperity. I forget the exact term that you used. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think on its own, it's just a good thing. I don't know exactly what my phraseology was for that, but yeah, prosperity is a good one. But the other thing I said, I guess, was that the upgrade process has high potential for exposing problems or with the architecture or edge cases, and it's a good thing to do early on.
That was it. Exposed potential architecture. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. All right, and then we have 14 more minutes. So something I really wanted to drag attention to, focused on the second bullet point that Joe had pulled out or submitted, where it talks about how we're actually going to distribute OLM V1 milestones and eventually the finalized product. In the architecture we've been discussing, we've focused on individual components, and a user experience built on top of subcomponents. And so what that means is that there needs to be a way to package it all together and release it. And ideally, we standardize this release process across all of the components. And I think defining how we're going to do this early is going to lead to a much simpler release process, especially given the overlap between the teams and the potential for you to have to jump on different projects between different milestones, and making sure that it's fairly easy for us to capture all the work that defines, the state of the projects that defines some milestone or GA early on is going to pay its dividends as we move along. So that's one item I would like to really focus on. Does anyone have any opinions on that? Not in terms of implementation, but in terms of priority.
Well, I think the doing or sorting out the implementation early is pretty important. I mean, I have some ideas on implementation, I guess, but I don't know. I guess that's not really what we're discussing.
Yeah. I think, the first thing before we start talking about implementation details is actually just, like we said, when we start defining these future milestones, what we start with is a single sentence kind of defining what it is we're doing or want to do. And then as we get closer, we'll use these meetings to flesh out what is actually going to be done. And like that discussion isn't limited to these meetings. We can create the issue and then have a discussion there and like flesh it out as we go forward.
Yeah, I think just the most obvious need for me is like, I want to deploy everything and test it. Where do I go? And yeah. I think it's just important that we do that really early.
Agreed. Cool. That I think right now we're kind of just talking about all of the things that Joe proposed. I don't I don't think we can do all of this, right? Like, I think this is a lot of work, like just looking at this one bullet point. So there's probably like a need for us to, once after we've discussed this, to actually prioritize it. In terms of, the work we're looking at, I would go so far as to say, like, does anyone have any strong opinions on like the priority of these things? I personally think like opening the project up so that we can get more people involved and using the project and working on it is probably what I would propose is the highest priority. And that would kind of lend itself towards like defining the distribution process and making sure that we're starting to open up, remove some of the hard-coded stuff and allowing other people to provide DEPI sources. I'm totally open to people having different opinions and driving us in a different direction though. And this doesn't have to be, I think we can treat this as an ordered list, but we'll treat it as a like undecided ordered list for now. If that makes sense. We can eventually define what the actual order, like priority of all these items are.
I'm back, but I don't know if there was a lot of discussion about the order, but I kind of feel like the distribution stuff is like almost next after milestone 1. So I would potentially suggest putting that at the near or at the top.
Yeah, so we only discussed welcome back, by the way, Joe. We only discussed 3 items. We discussed like upgrades being like really useful in terms of like understanding like potential shortcomings in the design. We discussed the need for being able to distribute, a packaged OLM milestone 1 experience somehow. And then finally, we discussed, like there's some work Onyx doing in terms of defining the next generation catalog source API. And so opening DEPI up or redesigning, the milestone 1 so that we get rid of the hard-coded registry v1 client and start, defining the DEPI source API and making it so that we could, do a POC with some of the work that he'll be doing. Like that would be a good thing to do as well. So I think we're in alignment that, distribution and probably working on some of that DEPI source so that we can get more cooks in the kitchen would be like 2 good things to prioritize at the top.
No, yeah, I agree. I just think that the distribution stuff is going to be key no matter what or no matter when. And the sooner we do that, I think the easier it'll be to make more progress faster on other stuff, just because it makes the development process potentially easier. So I think in my mind, like the distribution piece is maybe less important for like external users and more important to be focused on like how do we build a distribution such that when someone wants to go and test something from end to end, a developer can go and do that really easily rather than have to go install Ruckpack and then go install operator controller and go create a catalog source. Like it'd be nice if there was like a single entry point to stand everything up and then a way to make it easy to add other development changes at that time.
Yep. And I think one other thing we get from doing that is, we hit a milestone, we complete some demo, E2E demo that we, define up front. And like the ability to actually see that is great, but giving people the opportunity to be like, oh, I want to actually use that and see what it's like is really important. And you can't do that unless you have a formalized distribution process. Otherwise, you have to do exactly what you said with like figure it out yourself, which isn't the best user experience.
Yeah, the other thing I would probably add, and sorry if I'm totally hijacking this, but as part of the DEPI source stuff, it seems like we could simultaneously abstract out the catalog source, like the OLM v0 catalog source, as like remember like in that diagram we've got the catalog source adapter stuff that Ankita's been working on. So if we combine that with the DEPI source API, that seems like fairly straightforward and pretty easy, such that we can then unblock some of the upgrade work. And then simultaneously, then we can also say like, okay, now we have a DEPI source API. Let's go have let's go use one of Onyx or the ecosystem team's prototypes and use a Depi source, like use the Depi source API with that as well. So that way we can see like, okay, is the Depi source API going to be good enough when we've got two different ways to do it potentially?
You know, it's funny you say that because that's exactly what the second bullet point has. Define the Depi source API, remove the hard-coded reliance on registry v1 and create a proof of concept for the next generation catalog source.
Yeah. So that's what I was talking about. I think the one part I would maybe de-emphasize a little bit is that I think it's totally fine to like build a registry v1 client abstracted by the Depi source and keep using that, because that's probably like a very low barrier like to make progress against. Whereas like if we don't do registry, like if we totally move away from the gRPC client, then we're sort of hitching our wagon to a prototype for a proof of concept that's like we're still working on. So that's why I'm saying like let's do both of those probably. That makes sense.
Okay, so are you suggesting that we, instead of removing that, sorry, let me reframe this. We're saying define the Depi source API and then move the catalog sources behind the Depi source and then create a proof of concept with the catalog source v1 doing the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay,
That way we can progress on item 3, even if the Depi source next generation catalog source API isn't done yet.
right, sorry, I think we're both talking about the same thing. So in this sentence, what I was trying to communicate was that, you know, in milestone 1, we're going to have the Depi library. It's going to be in that code using registry v1 client. And what I was suggesting is like introducing the Depi source API, updating the operator controller to watch and reconcile Depi sources as they become available, and then you know, the Depi, you know, you'd effectively have the Depi source adapter, which would use the registry v1 client to feed the sources into the operator controller, which I think is exactly what you're suggesting. I think it's just we need to update this sentence to better communicate that. Is that what you were saying?
Yep, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Okay, so let's clean this up so other people can infer that. So we define the Depi source API, move Depi's hard-coded registry v1 client into a Depi source adapter for v1 catalog sources. And create a POC of the next generation.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, what you got there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was like, wait a minute, I think we're talking past each other. Okay, cool. Okay, so that's some pretty good consensus. So regarding some of the other things that you suggested, we've got, we only have 2 more minutes, so perhaps we can, instead of adding this as a comment, we can keep, I'm gonna delete this and I'm gonna move it. I'm just gonna call this suggestion review. And maybe prioritize list of suggestions. The current prioritize list of reviewed suggestions. There we go. So I want to create a section that just kind of calls out, you know, these are the suggested focuses for milestone 2 that we've reviewed, and it's an ordered list in terms of which ones we think we need to prioritize getting into milestone 2. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm happy to have somebody else work on the wording, but maybe I'll just like spell it out here.
Did you make it through the whole list, and this is the kind of what rose to the top? Or is
No,
this- Okay,
so we've only reviewed these, which the following list of proposed ethics or proposed following list of proposed ordered. I don't even know how to phrase this. I'm sorry, guys. I'm like running out of energy right now. The following list of proposed milestone fruiters are ordered in. I'm just gonna do this later, but we
Honestly,
so
I don't know if the order matters that much. Like if they all make it into milestone 2, then they'll all be done theoretically before we say milestone 2 is done. It really just comes down to what blocks what.
yeah, I was trying to. What I was
Just
trying to
try
do
to
is provide a way of like, oh, we looked at
reorder
this.
that.
This one is less important than, this one,
Yeah.
the distribution one.
Got it.
And then I was just gonna say, when we finalize what milestone 2 is gonna be, it's more of a, we're gonna pick the top 3 because I don't think we'll get any more in milestone 2.
Yeah, gotcha. I think what you've written there is fine. You've said it's prioritized. Maybe you could change the dashes to numbers and that would make it a little more clear.
Okay, actually. Then reviewing these suggestions, the upstream community has decided that the following suggestions should be prioritized. That these suggestions should be prioritized in the following order. And then I had a note, missing suggestions have not yet been reviewed. I think that gets the point across, right? So it's an ongoing list. We're working on completing our review of all the suggestions. And right now, these are the top picks.
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, cool. So next week, we'll continue just to kind of mull over these suggestions. I encourage everybody to, add to the list of suggested focuses for milestone 2 if you want it to go in a different direction than what's seen here. Otherwise, please become prepared to engage with the community about which ideas you think need to be prioritized over others. Right now, I think we only have 2 more that we're looking at for milestone 2, which includes supporting more constraints in the operator API. Right now, we only support package name constraints, but we could do more. And then finally, supporting cluster constraints provided by bundles. Part of this is that stuff you were mentioning earlier about FBCs, defining dependencies and cluster version restraints. But something we need to decide if we're pushing into a milestone 2. Okay. On that note, I'm going to let everybody go. Thanks again for attending, and I will see you all next week.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Anytime.